So I was talking to my friend Pax about this review because I was a little bit nervous about how to talk about it. But I realized after his discussing it with him that I shouldn't be so nervous because there's only so much you can say about a game that sucks this badly. Oh my god. Worst. I mean, oh, for God's sakes, it's 2D sprites. What the hell? How do you deal with that? And when you have battles, instead of it actually happening, the entire screen just gets pixelated. I think that's a bug, actually. And there was no trophy support, no achievements at all. What kind of game is that? Give me a... Yeah, okay, I'm kidding. I got nothing. We were just joking about how it's the worst game ever and blah blah blah. Because the problem, to get a little more serious here, the problem I have with a game like Final Fantasy IV is it is literally easier to say what is there not to talk about it than what is there to talk about it, because it is a work of art. Final Fantasy IV is without question in the art category. In fact, if you were forced, if you put a gun to my head and said, "What are your 10 favorite games?" FF4 almost guaranteed would be in that list somewhere. It would be right at the top of my brain when asked about it. Not right at the top, because, that would be FF6 and Chrono Trigger, but definitely in the top 10, and which really, really says something. This is an amazing game, and I have no idea where to begin. One of the things that FF4 can be said to be is the amalgamation, the combination, the hybrid of Final Fantasies 1 through 3. They were so limited in the resources they had in the previous games that when they made the step to the SNES, the first thing they did was went out and said, "Yes, we will do everything." And this is hilarious, but not many people know that they actually had to cut that intended script down by a lot, by a huge amount, a huge margin in order to get it to fit. Now, I just mentioned that because FF4 was the first FF to really have a story. In fact, it is arguably the first RPG to really have a story, to really get into it, to really have an in-depth, flowing, amazing, epic adventure journey, emotional, personal, driving, thematic, stylistic story based on everything, and emotional and heartwarming and heartbreaking and awesome. I could keep throwing adjectives at you if you really want, but you get the concept here. The point is, Final Fantasy IV was incredible, and it's amazing to think about the fact that that story is actually the pared down version because they couldn't fit everything they wanted to in it. Wow, is all I have to say to that. But as I was saying, FF4 is the combination of everything before. They took the free-ranging, the exploration, the open world, the setting, the fleshing out of the setting of Final Fantasy 1. They took the character focus and the character-driven potential in the story from FF2, and they took the system, or rather the expansiveness of the availability of the system and the underlying thing. I mean, how many overworlds are there in FF4? There are 3, by the way. I could say there are only 3. But all 3 of those, well, actually 2 of those, are rather large, and the third one's just kind of small. But still, that's saying something. And oh my goodness, FF4 is such an amazing, huge, wonderful, incredible game, and I don't want to just jazz about it, but I just wanted to take this moment right at the beginning to say, if you haven't played FF4, please put this video down and go play it. I mean that sincerely. FF4 is, in my personal opinion, the second greatest FF ever made, and again, one of the top 10 games ever made of all time. Final Fantasy IV was a thing of beauty, and one of the things, to give you an idea of where FF4 sits for me, this is kind of geeky. One of my, the little one, Sarah, I've been reading her a story for the last several days because it's a rather long story. I'll just reach to the plot, the punchline here. I have been reading her Final Fantasy IV from memory. I've been going through the story with her bit by bit, and virtually every day she'll say, "Can we continue that story a little more, please?" Because of just how incredible and how emotional, how impacting it is. And never mind the fact that the game itself was astonishing. Granted, back on the SNES there were a lot of irritations that still had to be worked out of the system, but those have been fixed with every remake of FF4. It's also worth noting that FF4 is the most remaked of the FFs, with the only competition being 1, believe it or not. And the other lack of competition being from FF7. Where's our FF7 remake? Sorry. But in all seriousness, it has been... it's just been one amazing ride, and it's really worth noting that as I'm telling her the story, I start, tearing up at certain scenes. I start just gushing about it because I'm just like, oh my goodness, still after all this time. In fact, when I'm done, I've moved FF4 up on the roster. It wasn't actually on my to play soon list of the games I was going to play, but I want to play it so badly because I've been telling the story to Sarah recently, and my goodness. So, moving on. Where do I even begin? I really am just kind of at a loss. Let's talk about implications, or what I mean by that is implieds, which isn't actually a word, but I'm trying to get the point across here. One of the things Final Fantasy IV did a lot was they would give you a situation that wouldn't mean anything unless you think about it. I mentioned that 3/4 script cutting down thing. It's, it is something that is apparent upon secondary looking into it. The more FF4 is one of those games that the more you think about it, the more there is to think about, if that makes any sense. There's more to reveal. There's more to consider. Let me give you an example right off the top of my head here, because I was just going over this with someone. When you're just playing the game, it's too easy to just accept everything at face value and move on with it without really thinking of it from an in-setting perspective. And of course, that's just how some people prefer it, and that's fine. But I want you to picture a scene here, and anybody who's played FF4 will immediately know what scene I'm talking about, but I'm going to try and describe it rather than simply tell you what's happening, okay? I want you to imagine that a young girl has just watched her mother fall over dead in front of her, and as she's kneeling on the ground mourning her corpse, the entire town suddenly bursts aflame as monsters, literally monsters made of concrete flame, are racing through the buildings and over the roofs and into the woods and just burning everything, tearing it down to the cinders, and she is sitting there in utter and complete shock, sobbing her eyes out. And two large, fully armored men come up and start talking in an aside to themselves about how they just killed your mother and they have to get you out of here. So you freak out completely, and the next thing you know, well, let's actually switch perspectives here for just a second, shall we? Let's switch perspective over to Cecil here, and you, by contrast, again, let's set the scene properly here, because you need to think about this sort of thing to really get it. You are already in a place where you are questioning everything you've done. You are questioning your life and your loyalties and who you really are as a person. Are you really this kind of a person? And this is very close to the beginning of the game again. I just feel like stressing that because this is getting the point across here. You are in a sea of uncertainty for... Oh, come on. Come on. Net standard operating. How can I help you? Hey, what's up? Will do. Thanks, bye. Okay. I'm not editing for that one. That was just an informative call. I'm going to have to watch that now, but that's okay. So you're in a position where you're still trying to figure out who you are as an individual, as a living, thinking, breathing being. And you have come to question the man who raised you as his own child, who is the one who took you in and has been your father for all these long years. And he has just yelled at you and scorned you and sent you away to prove that you are still worthy of his time, of his love, of his adoration. And you go out, end up fighting what seems to be a trivial normal battle with a normal monster until you find out that the creature you just slew was in fact was directly connected through the life force of the individual, the mother in question, a young woman whose daughter is now sobbing profusely over her corpse. And you realize that though you were sent to this city as an errand, were actually sent to it as an agent of destruction. You were always intended to come here so this village would be destroyed. So you have now completely screwed everything up twice. Actually, more like 5 times, but who's counting? And you are basically in this complete and utter pit of despair at this moment, and you have no idea what to think or how to think about it or anything. But all you know is enough is enough, and you are not doing this anymore. And so when your friend suggests that you go ahead and slay that poor little girl, because that's obviously what the king wished it, you immediately and without hesitation say, with conviction, no, enough is enough. I am going to be myself rather than some lapdog. And you take this stand and try to help this girl, and Titan shows up and wrecks the area, completely sends in a mountain slide. You barely survive the incident. Get up. Now I want you to picture this. You are injured. You are broken. You are still probably have bruises all over the place. You're still in your armor, of course. And your friend is now gone, and there is a young girl who's laying unconscious on the ground. And so what do? You pick her up and carry her on your back through an entire desert, fighting off monsters, one-handed because you're carrying this young girl, while already injured, with no food and no water and no rest until you reached that nearest village, which you happen to know is there. You were going there for a good reason. You were going there towards that destination, so that you could let her down in a place where she can rest and recoup. She can rest and recoup, not you. Because that's the kind of person Cecil really is. And I'm sorry if I feel like I'm overemphasizing this scene, but you get the point out here. It's so easy to just play this game and not get it, and not really think about it, and not understand the full depth and the full emotion and the full expression. This one scene, which is basically the second scene of the game as far as overall construct and from a writing perspective as goes. This is overall the second real introduction to Cecil, and right there, right at the beginning, we see exactly what kind of a person he is. Cecil is a good guy. It is so rare to see that in any form of fictional art, to see someone who, the protagonist, who is just unequivocally, unflinchingly good, a good person. You know what I mean? I don't even. I feel like I'm using poor words, and it's because I am. But someone who is not gray, someone who does not have, a dark side to him, someone who's not an anti-hero, someone who isn't an asshole, someone who isn't, some other kind of problem along with it. No, no, no. You're a good person who is nice and kind and polite and understanding and intelligent and patient. That's Cecil. There's a reason that Cecil is the paladin. This is another thing that people don't really think about that often. Paladin as a class is something that's existed for some time. Dungeons and Dragons at the bare minimum, but obviously, other works have used it since and before. The point is, though, that most settings have paladin as a class, but there's only one in this entire setting, in these entire worlds, plural, and it's Cecil. And there's a reason for that. And there's a reason that he was a paladin before he even took up the armor, if you know what I mean. And I'm sorry, I keep getting interrupted tonight. That's what happens, I guess. Nothing to be done about that. But the point I'm trying to get across here overall, I could list many other specific examples here. But Final Fantasy IV is one of those games that the more you think about it and the more you feel about it, the more in depth you go to it, the more there is to reveal there. And you could really tell that there was more story that was supposed to be told that just wasn't, because they didn't have the space, they didn't have the time, they didn't have the literal anything in order to do so. And it's almost unfortunate, because even with the bare minimum of what we have, even with the edges of what they managed to cram in there, what we still have is a magnificent piece of a dripping character piece. And this is another interesting point. This is something FF4 hit the nail on very well. Yes, you are fighting against an unknowable force. FF4 had so many elements to its overall story. Let's look at the opposition here, not just antagonists, but the actual opposition from a thematic perspective. We have the evil empire, as represented by the kingdom of Barren. Hang on just a second. This might actually be a problem. I might have to actually pause. I don't want to do that. We had the evil empire, as expressed by the kingdom of Barren. We had the ancient unknowable evils, which is actually not expressed by Zemus or anything like that, but actually expressed by the fiends, and by Golbez even though he isn't actually that, but that is the impression we get. We do have the feeling that Golbez is what I now refer to as the classic fantasy villain, because and indeed Golbez is basically a classic fantasy villain on the surface. We have consequently the the personal reveal, the large scale reveal. There are actually several reveals in Final Fantasy IV, and all of them were rather well handled in my opinion. We have the deep and personal betrayal aspect of opposition, most obviously represented by Kain, but also represented in several other aspects. For example, Rydia being betrayed, or at least the way she felt that, by several of the individuals around her and the circumstance she was under. Cecil being betrayed by Baron, except it wasn't actually Baron, but we didn't know that at the time. I could keep going, but there are several instances of that. I need to keep stopping myself because I could give many examples. I know this game inside and out so well. There are so many examples of personal betrayal and bringing it to a really individual level. And I could keep going. I haven't even finished the list yet. These are all the different. We also have the ancients thing. You know, the old technology, the predecessors, the precursors, all that sort of thing. With the Tower of Babel and the Giant of Babel and the Lunarians in general, and of course there's a term for this, and I don't remember what it is, but it's basically the force of antagonism, the enemy, the villain, the evil, that is so powerful that even though it is contained, even though we are only seeing it at a portion of its strength, it is still stronger than anything we have around. That would be Zemus in this case. There are so many different ways that FF4 presented the full tapestry, and I think that's really where it shines to me, where it really outshines so many other games, even modern games, even later FFs, is because Final Fantasy IV was a full tapestry. It was every single element of things that we would even call mundane or cliche or normal or whatever, overdone if you wish, but it had all of them. They all worked in coherence with one another to some extent or another, and they all flowed beautifully. They all if you could imagine a chart here, I'm not going to get that geeky. It all just moved beautifully. It was a river, and the river wasn't always level, and it wasn't always at the same place, but it always ended up together, and it always formed this one cohesive force of moving, flowing, beautiful water that I could gush about for hours, and I'm really trying really hard not to. I'm sorry. Let me pull back. Raining. My goodness, because that is one of the biggest strengths of Final Fantasy IV, and I really think that deserves to be mentioned. Now, one of the other things they did with FF4, again, trying the different styles thing, the different systems thing, they had already introduced summons. I didn't mention that back in FF3 because I didn't think it was that relevant enough to do so, but summoning was a thing that they introduced as an actual system back in Final Fantasy III, but it was only done basically as another form of magic. It was another spell is what it was. Summoning didn't become important from a character perspective, from a story perspective, from a lore perspective until Final Fantasy IV with Rydia and with her summons, the Eidolons, if you're playing the remakes. Excuse me, my throat's starting to hurt. And the Eidolons were an integral part of the plot at several points and several levels, and an integral part of Viridia's growth as a character and the growth of the party. The party would not have gotten anywhere near where they were supposed to be except for... Oh, gosh darn it. I don't want to deal with that tonight. Okay, I'm going to pause here and deal with this, and then I'll continue my video later. Alright, I'm back. Sorry about the delay there. Just to finish the point I was just talking about. Actually, I had to go remind myself. It's been a little bit. The progression of the party, the progression of the story, would not have happened in anywhere near the form it had without the interference. I shouldn't even say that without the interference. Without the assistance of the Eidolons. Yes, several of them were optional bosses, but if not for Leviathan interacting in the way he did, obviously a lot of things would have been different, not the least of which being the second drop spot wouldn't have happened the way it would. But more importantly, Rydia would not have had the time to become the fully mature caster that she did, actually have time to finally how do I put this? So one of the things I wanted to mention about Rydia was that while she was given exceptional time amongst her friends, amongst her fellow Eidolons within the land of the summons, the fact of the matter is she was ultimately she was still isolated. She did not actually have a lot of room for maturity, for actual emotional growth. She was still mentally and emotionally, effectively, I should say mostly emotionally. Mostly emotionally, she was still effectively the same child she was when she left, which is one of the reasons why she is such a glue of the party. I've said this before. Of the party, I know I'm kind of roaming here with my topic, but I wanted to talk about the party in general first really quick here, or next rather, so let's just move into that. Rydia is effectively the glue of the party. Yes, Cecil is without question the main character, and indeed the only character who stays in the party throughout the entirety of the game. And I'll discuss that more in a little bit as well. And I need to turn the thing back down, don't I? But and Rosa is obviously Cecil's counterpart, basically. And I say that because it's not so much Cecil leans on her or she leans on him as they lean on each other. This is Cecil and Rosa right here, if you understand what I'm meaning. The two of them support one another, and between the two of them form a much stronger bond, a much stronger force than either of them would have been segregate. You know, Kane is obviously the friend, the rogue, the solo aspect, but nevertheless a powerful enough individual in his own. Blah blah blah. I could go into such details, but Rydia was the glue. Rydia was the emotional, the heart, as several people like to say. She was the heart of the party. She was the reason why the party accomplished so much that it did, and how much they managed to stand against. I'm not even talking about the actual opposition they had to fight against, ignoring the fact that Rydia is a ridiculously powerful black mage and a summoner. Let's just ignore the fact that she is the powerhouse of the group, basically, as long as she has mana. But if you have to consider in games like this what is going through the minds and hearts of the people that are going through these incredible, trying, emotional, difficult, terrible circumstance. If they didn't have someone like Rydia helping them go, I don't think they would have gotten anywhere near as far as they did. And indeed, it's worth noting that the tone of the game sinks considerably into a much more depressed and despairing tone until they get her back, because there's a fairly decent chunk there of time which Rydia is not in the party. Indeed, you think she's dead. And the whole tone of the game just plummets right there. I'm going to go ahead and talk about that really quick. I know I'm segueing horribly, but I'm trying to barrel through this, and while I'm thinking about it, blah, blah, blah. The overall story progression of FF4, one of the biggest themes about FF4 is being true to oneself is one of the larger themes. Cecil and Kane and Rosa and Rydia and basically everyone. Edward, Sid, a lot of the characters, major player characters and NPCs both, have that theme going throughout their character arcs, and being true to oneself, not lying to oneself, not submitting to pressures or societal difficulties or whatever, or emotional squabbles. No, just being yourself is something that so many of them have been. So many of the characters in the game personify, engender. I'm sorry if I'm stuttering really badly tonight because I'm really stressed at the moment. Um, Another and on top of that is the fact that every single okay, how do I even put this? How do I start this? The secondary theme, actually, I would argue the primary theme of the game is hope, because all of the previous themes, we had what is effectively good versus evil and elementalism, if you prefer. That'd be Final Fantasy 1. We had freedom versus oppression in Final Fantasy 2. We had light versus dark in FF3. In FF4, the theme is a lot more difficult to explain than in something so generic, and that's actually kind of the point. Final Fantasy 4 was not just another game to these people. They took what they had been doing and they took it to the next level. Rather than having some generic theme that can be explained in a single sentence, they said, no, let's really go with a theme for this game. And hope, while you could say, oh, you just summarized it in a single word, it's not even close to that simple. Final Fantasy IV's theme is about the necessary and required value and import thereof, of every living being that inhabits the world, that has the interest and desire to continue being a sentient and free-willed living being within cooperation with one another or in opposition with one another within certain limitations, such that there is a place and a shape for all such people with the level of tolerance that is difficult to express outside of the concept that while we are not uniform, we are nevertheless united. Breath. And in so doing, we fulfill our own hope by refusing to ever submit, by showing both hope, which is the value and pursuit of a greater tomorrow, and on top of that, the belief that the feeling of defiance, it's not just a passive hoping for the future, but in fact an active, indeed violent act of refusal, a denial of the forces that would seek to end their life and end their lives. And I'm not just talking about killing them, ending their way of life, ending the way they function, ending the way their world works, taking away their livelihood and their homes and their free will. And taking all that and standing together and standing strong in hope, in defiance, with tolerance for one another, united but not uniform, and in so doing accomplishing the impossible. That's Final Fantasy IV's theme. And I'm still summarizing, but you get the point. And that is really the point right there, is that Final Fantasy IV took the standard model and said, no, no, no. Things like this are complicated. And we're going to make this complicated because that's how things are and indeed should be in such cases. This is not, you can't simplify an epic story. It doesn't work that way. But you can, it's not even just complication. You can grow it. You can make it thrive. You can stretch it out. You can weave it and through it and etc. Hang on just a second. Oh my goodness. Sorry. Distraction after distraction tonight. And they decided to make FF4 an actual living. There's the word I'm looking for. A living story. A living setting. Living characters. FF4 was all about life. And I don't mean that, like, as in, oh, life must flourish. No, the game itself was very much alive. It had so much depth to it in virtually every aspect thereof, as far as the story, the setting, the plots, characters, etc. Now, I'm going to go ahead and be distracted again. I'm going to go ahead and take a moment and pause from my gushing about the various things I love about this game to talk about some things that, just to be fair, because it is worth noting that FF4 is not a perfect game. Heck, FF6 is not a perfect game, and that's the best game ever, in my opinion. Final Fantasy IV did have some problems. I call them aggravations, actually, because none of them were actually bad, but one of the biggest problems I had with FF4 was the lack of details. And this was in a lot of parts of the UI. The items, the inventory, the equipment, the inventory, and the spells were the biggest examples here. It took a long time to figure out what did what because it doesn't actually define it, if you know what I mean. I can't actually think of the name of the armor anymore, at least not in the original version, but there are several armors that, for example, make you immune to poison, or give you an additional 300 strength, or something like that. And there's nothing that says that anywhere. The only way you find that out is if you put that on and test it, the old-fashioned way, the manual way. And that was an artifact of the fact that this was still running off of some of the old code, some of the old system, because that's how the old games were too. And so you had that problem, and that just was very irritating. The overall menu was extremely clunky. Again, a bit of an artifact of the old system. So much of the more modern games, from basically FF5 on, although really FF6 is the one that perfected the model. So let's go ahead and say just from FF6 and on, going to the inventory to re-equip someone, or to use an item, or to use a spell was just whoosh. It flowed beautifully and perfectly, and you had no issues with doing so whatsoever. In FF4, it was more like, hang on, Okay, okay, open there, and then hang on. Okay, and then we. All right, okay, okay, we're done. There were a lot of little things, and honestly, I don't want to go into too many of the specific details because there are actually a lot of niggling little problems with FF4's UI and system, and I could look by that for two reasons. One, because so much of the rest of the game was so much worth it, but two, and more importantly, as I said, FF4 has been remade a lot, and every single one of these remakes has fixed all of these problems, so they are no longer an issue in any of them. And if I was going to recommend FF4 to someone, I'd probably recommend the remakes because A, you can't really get a hold of the original now, at least not at a decent price, and B, duh. So, enough said on that, Mark. Now, another problem, another problem the game had was there were several points in the story where you could. I mentioned before it's obvious that there was supposed to be more to the story, but there are several points where it wasn't just obvious that there was supposed to be more, but it felt like something was actually missing. Several of the shifts in setting and tone and in scene felt jilted in several cases, and you could tell that there was supposed to be something else there, and there just wasn't. Again, the DS remake fixed several of these things by adding a lot of these scenes back in, but nevertheless, this was a problem in several points of the story where you have this beautiful flowing movement of the plot and the pacing, and then it would just and then it would keep going like this as though nothing happened, which might not even be that noticeable if not for the fact that the rest of the story flows so smoothly. That's actually it. That's all I've got for complaints for Final Fantasy IV. I'm sorry. Most of my complaints were UE related, and I do need to mention them because the original game did have a lot of problems with that. Actually, you know what? I'm going to mention one other thing because this is important. This is actually very important. The Final Fantasy series, up until a certain game, that would actually be FF7, had translation issues. Every single one of them had I don't even know how to describe it to someone who hasn't seen it. You would have scenes where the dialogue sort of makes sense, but only if you're thinking in a certain way. And some scenes you'd have where the dialogue makes no sense at all, and you have no idea what's actually happening in the scene. And and several of the items would be named strange things, and there was no uniformity to the way things worked, and there was occasionally not even grammatical errors. We're not talking about that. Just, sentences that did not fit. And that was a problem all the way up until and including Final Fantasy VII. It was not until 8 that they finally got, the translation issues fixed and started, ironically, becoming one of the most amazing standard translations around. Duh. Although, of course, they lost that seat almost immediately. But they did do a good job on it, is kind of my point. So, I do have to mention that because FF2, if you're playing FF2, that's kind of my point. If you're playing FF2, aka FF4, the original version on the SNES or whatever, you're going to see some problems with translation issues, with difficulties like that, and with the UI, and with the clunkiness of the interface, and with lack of information. These are things you just kind of have to put up with, which is why I recommend the remakes, but it is worth noting that those problems were there. Let's get back to the story for a little bit here. One of the things they decided to do rather decisively, again, they had the actual characters just like FF2 did, and indeed every FF henceforth will. But they decided they wanted a main character. It is argued that Furion is the main character of Final Fantasy II and Luneth the main character of Final Fantasy III, with good reason. But when you actually look at it as a written work, as a work of entertainment or as a work of art, it is very obvious that that's not actually the case. They are simply main characters along with the other main characters. Now that can work in its own right, as FF6 proved very clearly. But what they wanted with Final Fantasy IV was to have a truly main character, the protagonist. I'd call it the Harry Potter, but actually, you know what? That's a good example. Forgive me. I'm sure some people don't like Harry Potter, but I mention that because while Harry Potter himself is very clearly and decisively the main character, it is worth noting that he does not operate in a vacuum. He is the main character, but he wouldn't have gotten anywhere if not for the help of everyone else. And this is where FF4 was going with this. a lot earlier than Harry Potter came out, I might add. But it's not a new idea. It's just it's a literary technique. You have the main character. The story primarily focuses on them, their personality, their struggles, their relationships with one another, or with the other characters. But they are constantly aided and working with and through other people as well. And so it's interesting that this dichotomy actually worked out really well because Cecil, as I mentioned earlier, is the only character that doesn't leave the party, but everyone else rotates in and out to at some extent and to at some point and to some extent or another. And I think that was an extremely effective technique for them to use. On top of that is also the fact that every other character who joins your party at the very least, but a lot of other NPCs as well, were very fleshed out. You know, the fact that Edward, to this day, is kind of considered a joke character, you know, the spoony bard, had a rather strong and solid plot arc, which was very emotional, very impacting, very sad, and it does a complete circle. His story does a complete circle throughout this course of the game and works out beautifully to the moment where his moment of triumph, where he has found his courage and he is forced those around him into working for the greater good because he knows this is the right thing to do, was an awesome moment because it was Edward that was doing that, if you know what I mean. And Yang, or Yong if you prefer, I think it is actually Yong, isn't it? I have such trouble with the pronunciation of FF4 names. It wasn't until the DS version that I realized I was pronouncing about half of them wrong. I used to say Cecil, Rydia, you know. Anyways, Yong is another excellent example of this. Someone who, on the surface, doesn't really have a lot of characterization, is more of a caricature rather than a character, but when you really start to, you have to kind of go into the background. You have to do some of the optional stuff, but you find out that there is more to him. That he has an actual character. That there is depth to him. You know, he cares about his people, his wife, his interests. He has a great deal of loyalty. He has constant difficulties with his own confidence issues and blah 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 blah. You know, all this stuff. Every single character. I'm not going to go over all of them individually because that would stretch this video out for forever because there are a lot of playable characters in Final Fantasy IV, which is another thing I'll mention in just a second. But every single one of them, to some extent or another, usually to a great extent, was very fleshed out. Now, Final Fantasy IV, while we're talking about firsts here, there's a couple other ones I want to mention here with relation to this. A lot of people made a big issue about Aerith dying in Final Fantasy VII. I apologize. I sometimes say Aerith. I sometimes say Eris. Anyways, a lot of people made a big deal about that for good reason. Tella was actually the first character to die in a Final Fantasy, in one of these types of RPGs in general, actually. This is quite a while ago, and Tella doesn't come back. Tella never comes back. He's dead, for real. And it's worth noting that in a game like this, you know, I mentioned that because Palom and Porom both come back, and Yang comes back, and Edward comes back, and Rydia comes back, and Kain comes back, if you want to go back that far. But Tella doesn't. Tella actually died, and he died in one of the most awesome ways. In fact, I would say the second most awesome character death in the history of the Final Fantasy series. I'll mention, if I get time to get to it tonight, I'll mention the next one in my next review. But he died in such a beautiful, almost meta way, because it made sense from a game perspective, but also made sense from a lore perspective in the exact same manner. He actually cast from hit points, literally. He, not to quote the trope, he actually was so limited in his potential for casting that he literally could not get the mana necessary to cast Meteor, even though he knew the spell, or Meteor, depending on what version you're playing. And yet, converted his life into doing so because his hatred had poisoned him so badly of Golbez that he wanted so badly to destroy him, and doing so was a pivotal and indeed turning point of the entire story for many reasons, not the least of which being the freeing of Kain, the defeat of Golbez, without which things would have gone much worse. That was also the first crack in Zemus's control over Golbez. It's the first time Golbez actually revealed his true self rather than the mind-controlled aspect of Zemus. Blah 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 blah. You know, a lot of things changed. That's basically the end of Act 2 as far as the game goes, or Act 3 or Act 5. It was an end of act, is my point. And Tella's sacrifice was not in vain, but Tella did die, and and it was a very emotional scene. It was a very impacting scene, and I just mention it because, actually, to be completely honest with you, all of the death scenes, even though only one of them stuck in Final Fantasy IV, were very powerful scenes, which really says something about it. And it's almost a shame that they brought several of them back, but at the same time, I would be lying if I didn't cheer the very first time when I was very first playing it back on the SNES when all the tanks showed up and Yang was there because I didn't know about the optional stuff. I didn't go to see him in the cave. Yang was there, Palom and Porum were there, and Edward was there, and I was just like, yes, that was so awesome. And I just felt like mentioning that. I feel like I just keep saying the same thing over and over, re-emphasizing why it is the story is so amazing. But it is. You know, let's get a couple of more bullet points here, and let's go ahead and cut this one off. The usage of a five-party system was a uniqueness, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, hasn't been repeated ever. The three-party system is a standard for good reason, and so is the four-party system. I'm not going to go into details of why, because I don't feel like getting into the math of the matter, but essentially, balancing a three-party or a four-party system is a lot easier than balancing a five-party system. Going to a five-party system was a gutsy move, and there's a reason they moved away from it. But I have to give them props for successfully making it work, for making it so that even with a party of five, the enemies were still sufficiently difficult. You had issues, blah, blah, blah. And it is also worth noting, while we're talking about the level of difficulty, as I mentioned back in my FF3 review, FF4, in my opinion, at least in certain editions of FF4, because it does change, has the perfect difficulty curve, which is relatively linear, still increasing, and then scales up right towards the end here, right? And then, of course, FF4, as I mentioned back in my FF3 review, was the actual first game when they invented the optional and the super optional thing. Now, it is worth noting that despite having a super optional, he isn't technically a super optional because Zeramus is still more difficult than he is. I'm referring, of course, to Bahamut. But this was the first time when they decided to test the waters with that theory. Basically, they had Bahamut, they had Odin, they had Ashura, they had Leviathan. I feel like I'm missing one. I could be wrong, but at the very least in the original there were those. They added more later, of course, in remakes, but nevertheless. Oh, and of course they had all the they had all the weapon guardians in the Lunar Subterranean, and so they really were testing the waters with the optionals and the super optionals, and there were actually quite a lot of them, and it worked out really well. A lot of us enjoyed the extra challenge, and indeed, in several of those cases, in fact, in all of those cases, actually, you got a tiny little bit of extra lore, setting, story, characterization, whatever, for doing so, which was awesome. You know, the fact that Barren was actually Odin just comes to mind immediately, and that's another one of those things where the more you think about it, the more it makes sense, and the more it's fleshed out for you. I could spend literally hours talking about individual plot points and the full extent of them when you really think about them. You know, looking past the surface of just about every single point throughout FF4 and figuring out what it was actually going on and the full depth and complexity of how it was moving. I'm not going to torture you all with that, don't worry. I just felt like mentioning it because, by God, I love this game, and that's one of the reasons why, right there, in a nutshell. The fact that I can just sit and think about it and enjoy it more, if you know what I mean. But let's go ahead and move on. The next thing I wanted to talk about, I guess I've sort of already mentioned this, but Final Fantasy IV was obviously very dialogue heavy. In fact, it was the first time they really had a dialogue heavy FF. Even FF2, which was rather story and character based, nevertheless pales in comparison to the sheer monumental amount of dialogue and in every aspect of Final Fantasy II, in the main characters, in the cutscenes, and of course in the NPCs and enemies in some cases. But it's worth noting that FF4 is also basically the origination of the cutscene. Yes, FF3 actually did it first. Final Fantasy III, even on the NES, did have cutscenes, but they had very few of them because of the limitations of the system. Final Fantasy IV took that cutscene concept and said, okay, whoosh. And so FF4 had huge chunks of cutscenes upon cutscenes upon cutscenes. But, and this is very important, FF4 still had a lot of gameplay fleshing that out. This is something that I feel Final Fantasy has lost over the years. I feel that that balance has been lost. It has been unbalanced. You know, it is. I've always said that all things within moderation, right? And finding the pivotal middle point, the right in the middle balance line, is the important thing when you're making a creative medium, especially something like a video game, which is by its nature an interactive media. The more of a story it is, I'm looking at you, FF13, the more you just find yourself wondering, why am I playing this rather than watching it on YouTube? I could also mention other games like Metal Gear Solid 4, for example, on this list. But the point is, while I have nothing against a long, extensive story that's intricate, that's complicated, that has long cutscenes, that has lots of cutscenes, you have to balance that out. Final Fantasy IV, along with many of the what I call the golden age of the Final Fantasies, which is the middle bracket here, which we just started with 4, found a beautiful balance between the two. Had lots of gameplay, lots of interactivity, and lots of cutscenes and lots of dialogue and story. It was right in the middle there. Now, FF4 was probably a little bit actually over here, leaning on the gameplay side, believe it or not, but it was nevertheless within the range of balance here, and that's one of the reasons it really worked, and I really wish they'd remember that fact rather than making interactive movies. Now, let's talk about the remakes. Plural. Of all the games I'm looking at, this is the only one I have to actually mention remakes of, because several of these games on this list, including FF1, including FF2 for that matter, have had several ports. But FF4 is the only one that has had multiple remakes. Different remakes, I stress. Actually only 2, but here's how this works out. They ported it to the PlayStation 1, which was just a port. We're not even going to mention that. Fling, it's out the window. They remade it on the Game Boy Advance, and the Martian Gaia loses his voice channel, which was a proper remake, which cleaned up everything, fixed all of my complaints, all the UE issues, all the clunkiness, gone, flung out the window. All of it was smoothed out. The graphics engine was received a small overhaul, so it was no longer choppy, no longer any issues like that. Very well done remake. What I would call a proper remake. Added content, added 2 new dungeons, one of which was mostly just for fun and for loot, the other of which was awesome. I actually recommend to people who are interested in the game that they play both proper remakes, because both of them are awesome for different reasons. And yes, I do own both. And it is worth noting, for anyone who's curious, this remake on the Game Boy Advance is effectively the same remake on the PlayStation Portable, the PSP. The Final Fantasy Collection, which is FF4, the Interlude, and the After Years, that thing. That edition of FF4 is the same as the Game Boy Advance one, with the 2 additional dungeons and the cleanup and blah blah blah, just so you know. In the middle of these two, good remakes, proper remakes, we have the golden child of all remakes. I've said this before, and it bears repeating. The Final Fantasy IV DS remake is what a remake should be. It is the most amazing, powerful, incredible, I have nothing bad to say about it, remake ever made. This is the definition of proper remake, okay? The 3D graphics, first of all, which involves rebuilding the game from the ground up, for anybody who's wondering, oh, what does that involve? No. They basically rebuilt the game from the ground up. Completely redid all of the dialogue and all of the cutscenes, which they had to do because they're using a 3D engine instead of a 2D one now. Added huge chunks of plot. Whole scenes, whole cutscenes, whole sequences of cutscenes were added in the DS remake and completely fleshed out the character. Golbez especially was very... Golbez, Cecil, Rydia, Edward, everyone was fleshed out much, much, much more in the DS version. They added voice acting. They only added voice acting to certain scenes, but every time they did, it was awesome, so I'm still going to mention it as a plus. They actually added mechanics. They added functionality to the game. The ability to use items. This is kind of hard to explain, but basically you could use items to give yourself an ability that you wouldn't normally have, and you got these for plot points or for doing optional stuff. And there was a lot of optional stuff in FF4 too. It's one of the first games to really do that. In fact, you know what, I'm going to take a pause. I'm sorry, I know I'm in the remake section here, but FF4 was also one of the first games to do the minigame concept. There weren't many and there wasn't much, and it wasn't actually what we would call a minigame nowadays, but it was where that concept whole began, and I thought it was awesome. Let's continue with the remake. All of those abilities you would give them as well would also increase their stats, and on top of that, carry with them through New Game Plus, which brings me to a point that by itself would almost make a game a proper remake. It had New Game Plus. Granted, it had limited New Game Plus, which I don't actually understand, even from a code perspective. But simply giving it New Game Plus at all? Yes. God, yes. Oh my God, yes. As I've said before, any RPG, and indeed most games in general, would benefit from a New Game Plus system. And adding that to FF4? Thank you. On top of that, God, I don't even know where else to go. I mean, they did so much. so much with that game and with that remake. You know, adding the CGI, remixing all of the music, and giving you little extra bonus things like the movie theater and all that fun stuff. You know, expanding the ending. And speaking of which, that brings me to another point. I'm going to mention it here. It's worth mentioning both for the main game and for the remake. Final Fantasy IV's ending is my favorite ending of a Final Fantasy to date, actually. There's only one other one that's in competition with it. That would be 6, in case anyone's curious. But FF4, as weird as this is going to sound, is the only Final Fantasy, in my opinion, that had a real ending. A lot of them had strange endings. A lot of them had kind of empty endings. A lot of them had endings where you were just kind of assuming what was going on. Again, FF6 sits in that category. It was a good ending, but it wasn't a real ending. It was a sequence of awesome followed by about 20 minutes of cutscene, basically, of zero dialogue cutscene, which was just kind of a head tilter. It still worked, but it wasn't a real ending. Do you follow what I'm saying here? I don't actually know how to vocalize this. FF4 had cutscenes, had a beautiful song playing over the whole thing that moved with the scenes, had dialogue, had revelations about the characters, understanding of what's happening next, had a very uplifting feel to it. It was very definitely a good ending. It's almost a shame that they made sequels to that game, I might add, because FF4 is one of the only FFs that truly and decisively ended. You know? FF6 would be the other one, ironically enough. But, you know, it ended. It stopped. The story should have stopped here, in my personal opinion. And so forth and so on. You know, that is worth noting because FF4 really did have a fantastic ending. The original did, even. The SNES version, never mind the remakes. The remakes had an incredible ending. My goodness. And I could keep going, but let me just summarize. If you want to play FF4, play the DS version. By God, at the very least, play the GBA or the PSP one. But all of them are fantastic. Now, let's go ahead and get into my usual little sequence here about the music. I've been putting this one off. The very first music I ever listened to and enjoyed was Mega Man 2's Heatman stage back in the NES. I remember that distinctly. But ever since then, I had just had a sort of fascination with music, for lack of a better way to cut it. You know, I found it interesting. I found it conceptually fascinating. I don't even know how to put it. But it wasn't until I played Final Fantasy IV that I realized I wanted to make music. I wanted to express my artistic talent through that medium. I wanted to make that. And so much, indeed, I would actually argue that about 60% of what I know about music theory, because I've never taken classes, I actually failed music theory, long story. All the things I learned about musical theory and the math involved and the formulas that guide it and function it and harmony and counter harmony and all that fun stuff, I learned by listening to FF4's music. This is not a joke. I mean this sincerely. By listening to the way Nobuo Uematsu did these songs, the way they flowed, the way they made sense, how he used his instruments, in relation to his other instruments, that is how I learned how to make music. And, excuse me, and FF4's music is absolutely incredible. If I were to, you know what, let's just make this point right here. I have a playlist on my iPod. It's called Zero. The reason it's called Zero is it is the absolute best songs of all time, no really. And every single song on this playlist has to fall under several categories. It has to meet several requirements in order to fit on here. On this list, there are no less than 4 songs from Final Fantasy IV, no pun intended. And I don't think anything else has anything even close. There's a couple here that have 2. You know, Final Fantasy VI has 2 here, I notice. And there are 2 Chrono Trigger songs on here. And actually, I believe that's it. So, I just point that to get the point across. These songs are not just good. These songs are amazing. I can't even put into words the sheer level of emotion that he managed to put into this. It's very clear that when he finally had a system, a software that could make music that wasn't just beeps and boops, that he could actually do strings, that he could actually do trumpets, that he could actually do, you know, percussion properly, they could actually do all this stuff. He ran with it. You could tell by the way the music was constructed that he was not just, you know, trying to do his job or even do his best. He was overjoyed. He was ecstatic to be able to finally express himself in this manner, and he flung his talent at FF4, at the music therein. And it shows. Oh my God, it shows. The music augments and accents the game perfectly. There are so many scenes that would just not have worked, to be completely frank, if they didn't have that kind of music in it. And there's so many amazing scenes that would have worked if they were completely silent or had bad music going, that nevertheless were elevated to be heartwarming or tear-jerking or incredible yes scenes because of the music that was playing for it. And indeed, of course, FF4 also gave us what is, in my opinion, one of my favorite of the last boss songs. You know, the one that plays for Zeramus, Everlasting Hatred. That song just spoke volumes to what you were doing there. It was, again, I mentioned this in FF3, but this is a feeling that has continued through FF4. You really did get that sensation. This is it. And okay, let's go ahead and segue this here, because let's talk about the last dungeon. This is last dungeons. There's two. Final Fantasy IV's first last dungeon started in the perfect way. I might have to stop after this. I'm genuinely getting a sore throat here. FF4's last dungeon started in the perfect way. The first one, the Lunar Subterranean, it started with an awesome epic cutscene and actually talking to the crystals. It's another one of those things that the more you think about it, the more it's awesome. The fact that this whole game, the whole game up to this point, you've been looking for these crystals and trying to find them and trying to see what you can do with them. And you finally encounter them, and not only do they talk with you, they converse with you, but they reveal that they have remained at this point of their own volition because they are what is keeping Zemus in at the moment. And the thinking about that and everything that means, and it's just like, yes! And then you start it up, and that awesome song, incredible song, the Barrens of the Open Skies, which I believe actually is referred to as the Red Wings, but whatever. The Barrens of the Open Skies fires up. And it's like, I'm sorry, I'm getting really enthused here, but it was such an awesome scene. And you go through this incredibly difficult, incredibly awesome dungeon within the depths of the artificial moon. And as you're going through there, fighting, difficult, hellacious, nightmarish monsters, getting your way through there, every single step of the way, crawling, scraping, fighting the optional bosses in order to get the gear, which was very much worth it. That place was also huge. The Lunar Subterranean was a gigantic dungeon, but it never actually went over the line. It never felt like the Infinity Dungeon in Breath of Fire 2. It never felt like Pandemonium in Final Fantasy 2. It was always awesome. When it was difficult where it should be, and when it got easier, it was easier where it should be, and then it would bounce between the two, so it never actually got frustrating in either direction. It just stayed awesome the whole way through. And it was... they invented a new tile set for it, which is saying something when you're dealing with a game this old, and you're limited, so limited to dealing with your tile sets. Yes, I know it was used in other places in the lunar area, but it was invented for this dungeon. You can tell just by looking at it, first of all, and second of all, you can look it up. But moving along. Then, after all of that awesome, after something that would trounce the heck out of last dungeons in other games and other RPGs, you then get to the Lunar Core, where one of my favorite songs of all time, it's one of the ones on the Zero playlist, plays. A song that was built specifically for that section. Because I mentioned earlier, a last dungeon should have its own music. And this one didn't. It had the Red Wing song playing. But then you get to that song, and you have this music playing, which again also played for the Giant of Babel, but let's just ignore that. And the see-through floors, and the core of the artificial moon below you, and every fight was a boss fight, more or less literally, actually. Every random encounter in the Lunar Core was actually a boss fight, was designed and tailored to be a boss fight. And then you have the optionals, and arguably super optionals within that area, Ouroboros, or whatever the heck his name was, the Leviathan wannabe. And just, oh my goodness, that whole section was amazing, was stellar, was incredible. And at the end of it all, you arise on the platform, and then you have the awesome scene of awesome, which leads me into my next category, which is the villain. As I said back in FF3, FF3 was the first one to do the first villain, second villain thing, Zand, and then the Dark Cloud, or the Cloud if you prefer. Final Fantasy IV is arguably my favorite example of that. While it may sound a bit cheap nowadays to do this thing, and indeed I don't think they should repeat this, it worked at the time. Golbez was built up to be the classic villain, and indeed, like I said earlier, is someone I consider to be the staple of what you would consider a fantasy villain to be. They built Golbez up, and he was powerful, he was competent, he was he had stage presence. His lines were amazing. Everything about him screamed perfect villain until the cracks started to show. That first crack I mentioned when Tella hit him with Meteor, and then cracks started to show from then on until it reached the point where finally Fusoya encounters him and is the only one around who is powerful enough to break that kind of an enchantment and kind of a mind control, and does so. And for the very first time, we see Golbez. And especially if you're playing the remakes, so much of Golbez is fleshed out, so much of Golbez is talked about and discussed, and you really see what happened to him and where he was coming from and why it was he was like this. And you understand the full depths of what we're dealing with. And again, we also have this theme here, that dark is not evil, which is interesting. I'm sorry for segueing, which is interesting in this game because one of the biggest journeys Cecil had in the first or second, or however you want to call it, acts, was setting aside his darkness and embracing the light. But at the same time, one of the things that really is emphasized is that Golbez, despite being what is effectively the dark half of the Brotherhood there, is nevertheless not evil. And in fact, not even a bad guy, not even a gray guy. Golbez was a good man who, unfortunately, had more darkness in him, which made him more susceptible. But there's nothing wrong with that. If you're following what I'm saying, if it wasn't for Zemus, in other words, Golbez and Cecil would have both been amazing, wonderful, kind, good men who would have made the world a better place. And arguably they did anyways. And Golbez was that was an incredible reveal. That was a beautiful reveal for two reasons. One, it was both personal and plot related. I mentioned earlier that the reveal in FF1 was plot related and the reveal FF2 was personal related. Again, this was the combination. This was deeply impacting to Cecil, deeply impacting to the party who had suffered at his hands, Kane and Rosa especially, and this was deeply impacting to the player and the overall plot, because up until this point we have been fighting Golbez. We only just heard about Zemus, sorry, very recently, like 2 scenes prior, well, 3 scenes prior, basically. And this whole game, Golbez has been the villain, the big bad, and he looks like it, and he acts like it, and he had the power to back it up. And no. And that was a beautiful reveal. And yeah, it's a little cliche now, but it was amazing back at the time. And it's still amazing because of the way it flows, because of the way it was worked. And so that's the first reason why that reveal is amazing. The second reason that reveal was amazing was it came at the perfect time, because something like that has to be handled very carefully when you have that level of a personal reaction. And I think they handled it perfectly. Golbez almost immediately was left. Did not stay to stick around and talk with Cecil. All he did was ask his forgiveness and leave. They didn't need the drama, is what I'm saying here. And they didn't have the drama. They refused it. They ejected it. They said, no. We're going to keep going the story, thank you very much. When you encounter him again, and when I say again, I mean basically after the last boss, they didn't have drama again. All they had was Cecil forgiving Golbez. Without even being asked, I might add, in this case. Golbez didn't ask this time. He just was like, I'm going to stay here and fall asleep with my brethren. And Cecil actually forgave him on his own, of his own volition, and acknowledged him as his brother, which... such a simple line and such a simple scene nevertheless spoke volumes. It was poetry, in my opinion. Poetry in its simplicity as well, because it was saying without saying, which is something FF4 does a lot, as I've mentioned already. Golbez was an amazing villain, and in order to accent such a villain, what you need to do is have one of two things. One, a reveal villain who has been with the story the entire time, or two, a villain you know almost nothing about but nevertheless provides a stark contrast, which in this case would mean a villain that's not very well characterized, that is much more powerful and much more evil. And Zemus was exactly that. We know almost nothing about him. He was the leader of the Lunarians. He wanted to take over the blue planet. They had to seal him, and he's amazingly powerful. That's basically all we know about him. And his hatred grew and grew and grew within the depths of the Lunarian subterranean, within the core, actually, until finally it reached the point where he basically lost control of himself, started reaching out, started working through others, enacted all of his evil plan and used all of the people that he could he could reach, that he could interact with, in order to enact his plan, which at this point was almost fruitless for his own ends. He basically just wanted to do it because at this point he was so consumed by his own hatred that there wasn't a lot of reason behind him anymore, and that worked. He wasn't that he was probably actually very intelligent, but he never demonstrated it. It was never demonstrated as a complex, in-depth character. He was just the black outline to Golbez, which worked great, especially since Zemus isn't the last boss, and this is another one of those space fleet from nowhere things. And without question, my favorite example of it, because it worked beautifully and perfectly and did nothing but helped the story. The thought that Golbez and Fusaya combined could defeat Zemus, yeah, that makes sense. The thought that Zemus's hatred, which we've already established has basically consumed him at this point, became so massive that it actually created its own life in doing so. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And the fact that that hatred is so powerful that it can only be stopped by the most powerful thing in the setting, the player characters, the protagonists, still makes perfect sense. And that whole scene was amazing. I still remember with chills Zeramus's entrance and his speech and the fight, and oh my god. That is the height of epic right there, Final Fantasy IV's climax and last boss. Which brings me to, of course, the final point on my little checklist for every FF game. The last boss. Zeramus was the last difficult, hard last boss of the Final Fantasy series. Exdeath was somewhat difficult, had some challenge to him, but not really, to be honest with you. Zeramus was the last one. From him on, every single one of the last bosses of the Final Fantasy series was either moderately difficult, kinda easy, or a joke. And that trend has never actually been broken until FF13. Actually, I'm going to take that back, because there were ways around Orphan, but moving on. And so, Zeramus was exactly what a last boss should be. Difficult, awesome. Again, designed just to be him. They actually invented a new technology, or a way of using the new technology, so that the background could go by, just so they would have a more interesting backdrop for an awesome fight. That's the only reason they did that. Again, because the last boss deserves it. I was just talking about this back in FF3. The last boss deserves to have that kind of thing, and Zeramus was a beautiful example of that. That whole... The background thing by itself was amazing. The song was amazing. The new spells they invented just for him, which is another thing Zeramus was a first thing for. Actually, I guess I'm lying on that. They added one spell for the Cloud back in 3, but moving on. You know, Big Bang. How many people remember Big Bang? Lots of people remember Big Bang because it was awesome and it was epic and oh my god, and he had Black Hole and all that fun stuff. Zeramus was a perfect last boss, is what I'm trying to say here. I would actually really seriously have to think about an RPG or a game in general that had a better last boss than Zeramus. Oh my god, beautiful beautiful fight, absolute poetry. Now, I want to mention one last thing as an aside really quick here. I apologize, this should have been mentioned earlier, I just spaced it. The DS remake is much more difficult by many, many points than any of the other versions, okay? The reason they did that is very obvious, because it has New Game Plus, and because you have more customizability with the ability to add everyone new abilities to the people with that new mechanic I mentioned. So you have more customization, and this is a flat rule. The more customization you give to the players for their party in an RPG, the more powerful they're going to be. Period. Because people are going to come up with things. People are going to come up with combinations and ways of using things and ways of working around strategies and fun stuff like that. So by default, they had to make it more difficult. The reason I mentioned that is my very first playthrough of FF4 was the definition of awesome. I've long since been a proponent of the fact that a character who is powerful in lore should be difficult and powerful when you actually fight him in game terms. Usually that's not the case, and for the reasons I mentioned back in my FF3 review when I was talking about the optional concept. Usually you want the players, all players, even the people who don't want difficult fights, to be able to beat the awesome character and get through the game. So you do have a lot of circumstances where someone who is supposed to be really powerful in lore and setting and story just kind of gets run over, if you know what I mean. The FF4 DS remake kind of did away with that. There's one fight I want to mention in particular, and it's the only one I'm going to mention. It's the only Golbez fight, actually, the only time you really fight him, which is right after you get Rydia, or actually right during when you get Rydia, when you first enter the underground, and you're tucked just after you fight the Calbrina. That fight in the original SNES version and in the GBA remake, I barely remember because I remember that as the scene where you get Rydia. It was an awesome scene, don't get me wrong, but I barely remember the fight. In the DS remake, that fight destroyed me. And the very first thing I thought when I died horribly, I mean, I was literally holding my DS like, but all I could think of was how awesome it was. Because he's Golbez. He should be that powerful. And so my second reaction, or probably my third reaction, was yes. And then I immediately, was like, yes, okay, let's go right after him. And he destroyed me a second time, and I'm like, yes, because it wasn't frustrating, it wasn't difficult. He was just hard, as he should be. He just flung powerful spells at you, and had a lot of armor and had a lot of health. It was very basic, but it was exactly as it should, because it's Golbez. He should be that powerful. I thought that was pure awesome, and I just felt like sharing that. So, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I honestly could keep going. You know that? I really could. I could keep going for a long time. Here's my synopsis right here in a nutshell. Final Fantasy IV is one of a small type of game that reminds me that life is actually worth living. And it's a very rare thing, in general, I should say, because games aren't the only thing that do that. It's a very rare thing that does that for me. It's a very rare thing that reminds me why it is I keep dealing with this, why it is I keep putting up with mundanity and normalcy and money and age, sickness, Why do I keep putting up with this? FF4 is a game, due to its themes, due to its emotional content, due to the in-depth layers therein, and due to everything that the characters go through, and I do mean go through, strive through, struggle through, reminds me why it is that it is actually worth continuing to take that next step. And to me, that is a priceless thing. And that would be my synopsis on Final Fantasy IV in a nutshell. I strongly recommend it. Now I'm going to go rest my throat, and we'll see if I can't do one more review tonight, because I got the time. But we'll see. I'll talk to you guys later.